So, we've worked with the Face Refiner, which is a great tool, but its smoothing and beauty functions might not be quite good enough, which is a good thing that we have a dedicated plugin for beauty work. This smooths out details on any given surface, typically skin, in order to give a more pleasing, idealized look on screen. Beauty is intended to work on skin, but can in fact work on anything, and by default it's going to smooth out the whole image, and I will show you what I mean. So I've got an image from the Shana vs Everyone project here, and I'm going to drag beauty onto the latest empty node, and if I drag amount and scale up, you'll see that it's actually smoothing out the entire image and not just the skin on this image. So the first thing I have to do is actually pull a qualification and then make use of the beauty effect within that qualification. So I'm just going to pull a quick key on the skin here. Can lose some of the greener, yellower stuff. And I'm really just looking to get the skin tones here, and I'm going to use a garbage mat to make sure that I keep just the face and don't get the hair and the wood over here. So, Arri Alexa is great stuff, isn't it? I love working with Alexa shot stuff. Okay, fine, that's a good start, so I'm going to combine that with the garbage mat. And let's just check how this moves within the shot. So let's just check the key. Okay, we've got a little bit of chatter, so I'm going to go to closing circle radius iterations 2. Okay, so I might just bring it. There we go. Cool, so I've got a pretty good skin key there, and I can now work within this key using the beauty effect, which I've applied to this node. So, when using the beauty effect or something similar to this, we want to see the image as large as we possibly can whilst working with the effects controls. And there's a trick to doing that. If I hold Shift and hit F to make a full screen effect, if I have the settings for an effect open when I do that, I keep them open up here, so I can now see what I'm doing, but with a full screen. And with the beauty effect, it's very important that we do this because we need to be able to see something large and with a lot of detail. So now that we've got a full screen sorted, we're going to move on and take a look at the actual controls themselves. So by default, the beauty plugin is set to automatic, and this is super easy to use, and in a lot of cases it's going to be enough as well. It's pretty good. We have 3 sliders here, and the first is amount. This is a measure of how much beauty work is carried out, how much the skin is smoothed using the automatic preset. Dragging it to the right smooths the skin out, dragging it to the left performs a sharpening operation, which makes it look a bit like a zombie. We don't really want that. Next, we have scale, and this actually has an odd effect on our skin smoothing. When taken right down to 0, scale will remove the smoothing effect entirely. So I can set my smoothing amount to 1.5, my scale to 0, and nothing's going to happen. And if I take it right the way up to 1, it actually has a very diffuse effect on the image. It's not the same as an opacity setting. We have the global blend right beneath this one. Our automatic skin smoothing has the strongest effect when the scale is set to its default value of 0.5. We can get more finessed effects by increasing the scale with larger amount values. It's counterintuitive, but there we go. So let's say, for example, I've got amount that looks a little bit much, but then I can increase scale slightly to about 0.7, 0.75. And here I can toggle off, and I can toggle on, and we can see the effect that has on the skin. I might take amount down to 0.3, and scale to like 0.65. Maybe 0.4 then. And we can see the kind of skin smoothing effect that has. Now that gives us a more idealized view of the skin on this actress. It gives us a more kind of idealized image. It's not too artificial. We wouldn't know just by looking. What we don't want to do is do this kind of super smooth porcelain doll thing. That never works out well. And I've seen a few projects where too much of that has been done. I found the first few episodes of the second series of Ripper Street were a bit aggressive on the skin smoothing, personally. Now, most of the time auto is good enough, but we will want to get really in-depth at times, so we're going to cover the advanced settings as well. To do this, we're going to go to the operating mode drop-down menu here and choose advanced, and then we get all of these different settings as well. Now, the first thing to realize is that if we switch back and forth between automatic and advanced, Resolve will remember, and it will only apply the active mode. What we do not have is our advanced skin smoothing stacking on top of our automatic. Okay, so if I go back to automatic, that's still there. If I go back to advanced, it resets to 0, and then I have all of these advanced controls that I can use. So we now have a whole range of options we can use to fine-tune our beauty work. We'll start with smoothing, as this is the most basic function, and here it, unsurprisingly, smooths the qualified regions of the image out. Dragging it all the way to the right, it's going to smooth it right out. Dragging it to the left is going to do a kind of weird sharpening effect. It's one of those settings where you have a very kind of loose, light touch. You don't want to use a lot of either in either direction. Next we have diffuse lighting, and this has the effect of blurring out the skin but has a greater effect on diffusing the highlights in the qualified regions of the image. This can help us avoid sharp highlights undermining the effect of our skin moving, because regions of sharp contrast can make our skin blur look a little obvious. An interesting point here is you can actually play these two effects against each other if you're looking for a subtle effect with only a little work. Try to make diffuse lighting positive and the smoothing threshold a tiny little bit negative to see what you get. So I can sharpen slightly this way, negative 0.1, and put diffuse lighting up here, maybe negative 0.5, and the effect I get kind of smooths out the highlights on her face. Alternatively, I can put just a little bit, maybe 0.75, 0.075 of blur, which is still a lot. So, this is a good starting point for our skin. The eyes are a little bit blurry and we have features that we need to recover, and that's exactly what we're going to do with the next set of sliders. Now, the next one's actually a blast from the past for me, as I have my roots in Photoshop before I even got into film. Texture recovery uses a trick which is very similar to what an old-school Photoshop user would call a high-pass overlay. To understand what these controls do, we have to check the Preview Texture box. Now, this funky grayscale is similar to what the high-pass filter does in Photoshop. It increases the contrast locally within a series of regions within the image, and this creates the effect of a very textured and noisy looking picture. By itself, this image is useless, but when placed on top of the original with the overlay blend mode, it has the effect of sharpening the image. The texture recovery controls within the beauty effect do something similar. The texture threshold setting increases or reduces the contrast within the high pass image, and the add texture effect then blends that with the original image in such a way that it can either enhance or reduce the perceived detail within the image. So let's take a look at this then. I've got my default texture threshold, and then I can go add texture, and you see as I use this, skin pores and defects, well I say defects, that's a bit harsh, blemishes start to come through the smoothing a little bit more, and you can see that I can go all the way, or I can indeed do a weird emboss edges effect here, which I've never had to do because it looks awful, but I can go in the opposite direction and blur them out a bit as well. So I'm going to add texture a little bit here, maybe 0.15, 0.2. I'm going to increase my threshold a little bit. There we go. And now you can see that I'm still maintaining some of those textural skin details here, which I want to maintain some of them. I don't want all of them to go because it'll look artificial. So using these sliders is an art of subtlety, and there shouldn't be any really obvious changes here. You're just trying to convince the viewer that the skin is natural but idealized, so we're not looking for things which are really big and brash and obvious. And finally, we have feature recovery, and feature recovery focuses on discrete features and attempts to bring them through our skin smoothing intact so that we don't get distracted by any features which are too big or detailed to be convincingly blurred out. To understand what's happening here, we should check the Preview Recovery Areas box. At the default value of 0, we don't see much, just the edges of the qualification we've pulled for the effect itself. As I drag the recovery amount slider up, you'll notice that we get white specks and regions growing over our image. These white regions are another form of qualification, one that excludes the regions underneath from the smoothing effect. The slider will look for discrete, high-contrast features and try to cut them out of the original skin smoothing. So things like moles, cuts, scars, or other things that are sharp in their detail will be spared the blurring effect, which would look fake on such features. When I bring this up, you can see that the blemish on the right-hand side is brought back and no longer looks artificially brought out, and we can see that we're getting sharpness back in the eyes as well. So if I drag this up a fair amount, you can see there's a kind of textured blemish just here. And if I drag it up, that becomes more obvious. And I'm looking for, there we go, I'm looking for good stuff around the eyes, the eyebrows, edges of the lips, nostril, nose. Those contours are very important. And here we now have some quite nice sharp features which are being emitted from the kind of skin blurring effect, and the whole thing looks a lot more convincing. So now we can take a look at where we were before. And this is a slightly blurred, more matte-looking, idealized version of this actress's skin. And obviously we also have our familiar global blend slider at the end of all this, so we can always tone our look down if we need to. I'm going to leave global blend probably about 0.15 this time, or 0.1. And there we go. I might bring feature recovery down, I might bring my texture threshold down, I might add texture down a little bit, so I keep, sharp eyes, nostrils, lips, but I don't get so much blemish detail over here. So this is an okay beauty grade. In fact, it's pretty good. We'll just take a look at the before and after. Now, it's a subtle thing, but it does make quite a lot of difference, and that's kind of what we're after with beauty work. It's just a kind of a slight little nudge to make things look a little bit more idealized. Now, beauty work is time-consuming and requires a lot of patience. If this all seems a bit fine detail and daunting, then don't worry. It's one of those things that comes with practice. Just remember that less is more. You don't want people to think the on-screen talent is out of focus. This was quite in-depth, so take some time to practice and process this new tool. Remember, this is in-depth stuff and we don't use it all the time, only when necessary or when there is time to do so. The important thing is not to get carried away with tools like this and miss your deadline as a result. Once you've had some practice, click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. The color compressor is a super useful effect for corporate and ad work, where certain colors of uniform, costume, or other products on screen must take the closest possible match to the brand colors provided by the corporate client. So here, I have a color swatch from the client for this video. Now I've got loads of football shirts throughout this edit, as you can see down here. And the red for these shirts is off. This particular client has a very specific shade of red for all their kit, and it's extremely important that this shade of red be reproduced in this video as a result. Now I've got my basic grading done here, but I've got a problem. The red of these football shirts is an off-orange colour, and the shirts themselves vary due to the lighting conditions in the shoot. It's not good enough for a corporate ad like this to have uneven colour in a piece of costume so important to the client's brand. I need to fix the red of this shirt so that it matches the client's brand colours. I can do this with the hue versus hue curves, but there's an easier and much more reliable way to do this, and that is the color compressor effect. Now, the term compress is deeply unattractive in the world of post-production, but this effect does not actually cause any form of lossy compression or image degradation. The color compressor takes all the colors that are qualified in our node and tries to nudge them to be closer to another target color. What this means is that I can tell this node that I want all the values in the off-orange football shirts to be much closer to a value that I can actually define. Can you see the attraction of this yet? We're going to go through how we can actually use this. Now in this node I have a key for the football shirts, and I'm going to apply the color compressor effect to that. So now that I've applied the color compressor to this node, it's only going to act within the regions of this key. I can now use the target color box to define the color that I'm going to push all values towards in this node. So here it says white. I can click on it and then I get a color dialog up here, and I can choose any color I want, hit OK, and then I can actually force things to just turn into that color and nothing else should I want to do so, but that's not what we're going to do with this effect. So when choosing the color I want to use, I have a problem. I cannot use the standard eyedropper to choose a color up here, and the center red on this on this swatch is what I want. And if I use the eyedropper to pick from here, it's actually going to pick up the color of the image underneath the reference wipe. I need a way of making sure I get exactly this color into this box here, and I can do that quite easily. What I need to do is I need to bring up the reference still so that this color is visible, and then in the target color box I have here a button called Pick Screen Color, and if I do that I get a little crosshair, and now that will pick up the color of whatever is under that crosshair. It doesn't matter where it is, what part of the image it is, which image it belongs to. I could actually sample colors from my waveform, from my UI down here. I could sample the color of the little green dot here, it'll work. So now I just have to left click on this red here and hit OK, and I now have my target color, the kind of client red color in this box here, and I can now get rid of this reference wipe. This is really important. Pick Screen Color is what you want to use if you're sampling colors from a swatch or from a still of another shot or from the thumbnail of another shot down here, okay? So now that I have my target color picked, I'm going to get to work. I've got 3 sliders here, one for compress hue, one for compress saturation, and the other for compress luma. These sliders measure how close I am nudging all the colors on this image towards my target color, and it's on a 0 to 1 scale, with 0 being staying at the original color value and 1 being forced to adopt the exact same value as the target. So if I compress hue, saturation, and luma, you'll see I'm actually getting a completely flat red color here. I'm actually compressing all the colors and saying, no, you can only be this one value. Now obviously that's too much, so I'm going to have to finesse these sliders to get the football shirt where I want it. First off, I'm going to work on compress hue. This forces all the pixels in the qualified region of this particular node to become closer or take on a value which is closer to our target color. And what you can notice is that as I drag it further and further along, the overall color of the football shirt changes. So I'm going to go until I'm happy, and I'm going to go for about 0.6, 0.55, 0.6, maybe 0.55. Next is compress saturation, and this actually brings the saturation up to the value held by the target color. Now 1 is obviously too much here, but it's looking a little bit lackadaisical down here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this up until I'm happy, maybe 0.18 or maybe 0.16, and now we can already see a really good before and after, and I might just push it a little bit closer. We can already see a really good before and after. Before it was too yellow, a bit orange and off. Now I'm much closer to that very bright, vibrant target color that the client gave me, and that's what makes the color compressor a really powerful effect. I know for a fact I'm getting very mathematically close to a color that I have been given from an external source. So finally, we have compressed luminance, and this makes the pixels take on luminance values closer to the target. It has the unfortunate side effect of killing contrast as you use it. If you homogenize the luminance, you kill contrast, because obviously we perceive contrast in the difference between different values. So I'm going to leave compressed luminance alone, and under most cases I do actually leave compressed luminance alone. I usually make a use of both compress hue and compress saturation. Finally, we have global blend. We know what this does. I can just kind of fade the effect out if I think it's gone too far, but I'm happy with the way this is. So I'm probably going to bring saturation down and hue down a little bit. And here I have my much more accurately red coloured football shirt, and I'm happy with that, and it's dead good. This took, in practice, maybe less than a minute. I just go, right, click, bring this up, pick a screen colour, right, thank you very much. Go down here, compress hue, compress sat, look, I'm there. It's a really, really powerful effect for managing bits of costume, key props, key things in the shot which need to maintain very specific colours. Now, one thing that's very important for this effect is that you should not be using it on skin tones. I want to make that absolutely crystal clear right now. It is not a shortcut for working on skin tones, okay? people have a natural variation of hues across the entire body, in the face, in the lips, in the tips of the fingers, on the ears. If all of that becomes the exact same colour, it looks unnatural, it looks weird, and it does not look very convincing at all. We've got another lecture on the face refiner later on, in which we're going to go through how to make the most of the subtle variations in hue, especially on the human face. But for now, I just want you to get this into your head. You do not use the color compressor for skin tones, okay? So this has been a really good intro on the color compressor. It's an extremely powerful effect. It is great for props and costume, like I said, just not so much for skin. So we're going to cover more effects next, and click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now, this is one for hardcore qualification work. The Alpha Shrink and Grow effect is a plugin designed to fix complex problems with mattes and qualifications that are very, very complex. We'll go through an example of when we might do this. Now, this is one of the more complex operations in grading, and if it seems a bit niche and OTT complicated, don't worry. I don't have to use this effect that often, but when I do, it's for a very good reason. First, we're going to talk about the situation under which you might have to use this effect. We actually have every function present in this effect available in the HSL qualifier. If I click down onto the second page of Matte Finesse down here, we can see that we have a set of operations, and all of these operations are also available in Alpha Shrink and Grow. So what's the point? Well, this plugin lets us act on a combined matte, one we've stitched together with a key mixer node or even an external matte, an alpha channel that was originated outside of Resolve for use during the grade or an online edit. The setup is pretty specific though, so we're going to go through this step by step. So I've got something set up here. I have a complex qualification that combines mattes from two different nodes, and I've done this to try and get a very accurate qualification for the skin of this subject in difficult surroundings. You can see I've got one for the redder tones here on the skin, and then a second one for the yellower tones here, hitting the wood, but also the hair, more importantly. Combined these two keys together using the key mixer node, and the end result I get is okay, but needs a bit of work. I've particularly got some bad gaps up here in the hair, which need fixing before we can continue. So I've gone through and I've done my normal matte finessing down here. You can see I've got clean black and clean white. Now, the important thing is that I should not blur these at the moment. I'm going to apply my blur later on once I've combined them using the Alpha Matte Shrink and Grow. So now that I've combined these two keys together, we're going to use Alpha Shrink and Grow in order to fix the gaps in the hair up here. Now, the first step is actually to make a new corrector node. And I'm going to do something a bit weird. You can see this key mixer is feeding directly into node number 7 up here, which contains the actual skin adjustment, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the blue alpha output and I'm going to feed it into the RGB input of this new node. I'm then going to feed the RGB output of this node into the alpha input of node 7. Now look what I have here. I have a node that contains an RGB representation of the alpha channel created through the key. I can actually apply all of my grading tools to this key if I want to. And I can grade an alpha channel in order to further refine the key which I am pulling. Remember, alpha works on black and white. Black is invisible, white is visible. If I grade and make it brighter, it's going to help get rid of some of these gaps up here. That's actually a nice start by itself, but I'm going to do a lot more. So I'll undo that. We can actually grade and pull secondaries on a secondary key if you want, although there's only black and white in there, so there's not much point. But we can actually grade an alpha channel as though it were an RGB image, and this is a very, very useful tool if we're doing some really in-depth and really difficult grading. However, now that this alpha channel is an RGB image within this node, we can also apply effects to it, and to that end, I'm going to apply the Alpha Matte Shrink and Grow effect to the node containing my alpha channel. So now we can start to apply the same set of refinement operations to the combined key. So this qualification has a few small and visible gaps, so I can use Alpha Shrink and Grow to fix these. We have a few options on the slider here, so we'll break them down. And I'm going to do my usual trick of Shift and F to make sure that I can see a full detail image. If I'm going to fix the gaps in this key, I want them to be accurate, so I need to make sure that I can see it in full detail as I'm working. So first we have the operation drop-down menu. This lets us choose how we want to refine our mat. We can choose from shrink, grow, opening and closing, and these all do different things. Shrink will take the operator shape and use it to shrink the white part of the alpha channel down. So I've got operation shrink up here, and if I turn this up you can see that the key is actually getting smaller. So it functions a little bit like a matte choker from After Effects, but not entirely. Next we have grow, and that does the exact opposite. That makes everything get bigger. It takes the operator shape, you know, circle, square or diamond, and then can grow or shrink the key. Again, not what we want. We then have opening, and opening is going to take these little black spots in the middle of our key and it's going to stretch them out. And you can see as I do that, these black gaps here get a little bit wider. And then finally we have closing. And closing, as you can see, and this is what we're going to use here, closing will actually fill these black gaps in our key right here, and that's what we're going to use to fix this key. So obviously now I'm going to use closing here because there are slight gaps, especially in the upper part of the hair here, that I need to fill. And now I need to choose the operator shape. I have circle, square and diamond. Because this is quite an organic shape, I'm going to choose circle. And most of the time, like, I've tried different shapes before, but I find that I usually do come back to the circle setting here, because it does help me get kind of organic looking edges when I use the refiner. Next we have two sliders. We have operator radius and repeat operation. Radius adjusts the size of the operator shape, and repeat operation dictates how many different operator shapes we use to grow, shrink, close or open up our mat. So we use these two sliders in unison in order to get the effect that we want. So I'm going to put my operator radius up to 4 and repeat operation up. There we go. Until I just get what I'm after up here. So we're not quite finished yet. We've got a pretty decent looking key. I think if I just keep going up there. I've now fixed most of those gaps around the edge. There's a very slight gap up here, viewed in normal. I might need to add another one of these actually, so what I will do is let's just cut that there. We'll add another corrector. Do the same thing. We're going to add alpha shrink and grow here, but instead of closing, we're going to add grow. And I will just fiddle with that until I get rid of the kind of blue edge on the key here. There we go. We can use this effect multiple times to stack them up and then get really nice refined mats. So the next step is blur. We're going to get another node down here, and I'm just going to apply Gaussian blur to that, and I'm just going to dial that up to taste until I get a kind of a nice blurred edge there, stacking up these effects, and I now have a much better, much more accurate key, which seems to be stable throughout the shot. When we move, okay, we appear to have a little bit of a gap here when she moves her head, so I'm going to go back to the closing operation. I might just... There we go. Problem with the shirt down here. So in that case, in that node, what I will do is I'm just going to garbage that back down, garbage mat that out. There we go. And then I think I'm going to have to do the same for the other key as well. Usually like bits of rotoscoping and garbage matting when we there we go. Where is that coming from? Okay, it's probably been brought back. Yeah. Then let's just go ahead and we'll track that. Okay, and then we'll fix that little bit of basic keyframing, number 5. We'll take that off the edge there so it doesn't get in the way, and we'll do the same for this window up here. It's number 2. Told you this one was in depth. It is just what we find. Cool, and now we have a finished and highly accurate key. Here, let's just watch it through one more time. Okay, we have a little bit of a blip on the edge of the hair there. Let's just cool, there we go. So now we've had a very complex key. It's gone through a few different effects operations fed back into the node as well. Now this is a right mess on our node tree, so the final step would be select all of these, and I'm going to make a compound node. That just sits quite neatly in our node tree, and we now have... Okay, I've spotted one more thing I need to fix, and that's roto out this table back here. So I need to go inside the compound node, see where that table is, which is in here, and I need to do another bit of cleanup with a curve. And I just need to track that table. Cool, there we go. And I'll change the label here just in case. There we are. And now I have a highly accurate key. Should be stable throughout the shot. Going through, checking that, we've got a good key on the skin. And there we go. So that's a lot of work. It takes quite a while. Now, like I said before, if this seems a bit in-depth and weird, do not worry. It is not very common that we have to go this in-depth for a key, especially with like 12-bit footage. If it's been shot well, if it's been lit well, we can key out things fairly easily. This was I deliberately set this up to show off this tool. I could have probably gotten most of the work done here with just one good skin key like I did in the practical project. But again, I needed to show you how the alpha shrink and grow effects worked. So that's quite complicated, but don't worry about it too much. We've got one more effect to go through, and then finally it's onto our penultimate practical project. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now, I know, sharpening is a dirty word in any kind of image manipulation. There are some good sharpening plugins in Resolve though, and every now and again they can be a real help. So we'll take a look at the Sharpening Effects plugin included within Resolve. Of course, we already have a sharpening function present in the Blur palette, but it's very primitive and does not give us a great detail of control. The Sharpening Effects plugin is much more nuanced. So first, we'll take a look at the standard sharpen filter. I'm just going to drag it onto a new node here. And then we can start looking at the controls. Now, as I did last time, I'm going to use Shift and F, and then we can take a look at the full screen alongside the effects controls. So this sharpening effect is cool insofar as it breaks the image down into 4 levels of detail that it can work on. This gives us much more control over how we sharpen our image. We have the main slider at the top, which is Sharpen Amount. This dictates how strong the sharpening applied to the image is. It's just like using the Sharpen function in the Blur palette, dragging those 3 sliders down. But it's the next 4 sliders that make this effect much more powerful. We have these 4 sliders here, and they dictate to what extent our sharpening function is applied to different details in our image according to their size. These sliders let us tell Resolve that we only want the larger details sharpened. We don't want to give the skin this kind of crazy textured look that we've got going on here. Or conversely, we might want to sharpen only the finer details, and we want to avoid sharpening big details like lips, nostrils, and eyes. So we're going to break this down and take a closer look. So first we have the Fine Detail Size slider. This decides the overall size threshold of the fine details in the image, things like hair strands, little bits of texture. If we drag this down, it will start to exclude larger details in the image, and if we drag it up, it will start to include larger details in the sharpening operation. It's important to note that this slider has an impact on both the medium and large detail sliders too. When adjusting this slider, you want to be careful and not make the skin look too textured. So I'm going to drag this down a little bit because I don't really want the fine details to be here. Next we have the sized detail sliders. These all dictate the level of sharpening applied to different details of different sizes according to the value of the fine detail slider. Now that sounds complicated at first, but think of it like this. Any detail below the size indicated by the value on the fine detail slider will then be acted on by the fine details slider, which is this here. And if I drag this up, you can see all the fine details getting much sharper and much more accentuated. Then any details a little larger will be acted on by the medium detail slider, and I can use this here and you can see the effect that has. And then any larger still will be acted on by the large detail slider. And considering that most of this, and that is not a good look, if we drag it right up to the max, that looks a bit nightmarish. But we'll take this down to about 40, and then we can just bring this right down. There we go, and then maybe bring the large details up a little bit. Using these 4 sliders in unison, we can choose just to sharpen the larger details like eyes and facial features very slightly, whilst not making the skin look like sandpaper. Each of these sliders dictates the level of sharpening applied to details of the relevant size. Now these sliders all start at the value of 1, which means our sharpen amount value is applied directly to the details governed by the slider. Because of this, the most effective way to use this tool is to choose a relatively low sharpen amount value and then dial it in to taste with the 4 detail sliders. Think of the detail sliders as multipliers. At the default value of 1, we have all of our sharpening applied. So if we make these values higher, the sharpening gets more intense for the details governed by those sliders. This means we can apply significant levels of sharpening with great accuracy. It all sounds complicated, but just remember to choose a low sharpening amount and then use the detail sliders to amplify that and accurately apply your sharpening. So for example in here, I'm going to set my sharpen amount to about 0.12 or 1.12, and I'm then going to bring my large details up just a little bit. In fact, I'll make it 0.5, 0.05. And then I can bring my large details up very slightly to like 0.06, that's still quite heavy. Fine details has gone crazy. Maybe 0.04. And there I have some of the more accentuated detail on the face here being sharpened, the eyes are sharpened, the nose is sharpened, that kind of thing. And I've left the other fine details and the medium details alone because I don't want to sharpen the skin pores because that always looks awful. So there we have a nice little bit of sharpening. It's very slight, but it's also very accurate, and it's much more accurate than just using blur and sharpen in the blur panel. Finally, we have the Sharpen Chroma slider, and this is going to sharpen the colour of the image independent of its contrast or luma. It's an odd one, I've never found much use for it, but it can be used to make a kind of creative chromatic aberration effect. It can be useful in certain cases, when maybe you've got very odd lighting, or maybe you just want to sharpen up the colour a little bit for a kind of stylized effect, but I don't use it a great deal. So this has been a decent overview of the Sharpening Effects plugin. It's good for a final touch if something just needs a little pop, but just remember, sharpening is an art of subtlety. Don't go overboard like this. Or you're going to end up with an image that has so much detail in it, it almost hurts to look at it. Less is always more with sharpening. So now that we've covered this, we're going to cover our final effect in this module, and that's the grain effect. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. We're at the end of the Advanced Node Tree module now, and I thought we'd round it out with an easy, fun effect: film grain. Yeah, we can add filmic grain directly in Resolve without the use of scans or third-party plugins. Now, scans of actual film grain always produce the best end result, but they're also not free in most cases. The film grain effect in Resolve will let us simulate the effect of different film stocks and easily apply that to our project. Now, because we typically want the film grain to be consistent throughout, one of the best places to apply it is in a corrector node in the Timeline workspace accessed from the drop-down menu in the top right of the node tree. So here I'm in Clip, I'm going to go to Timeline, and now I'm going to make myself a new corrector node up here. As long as I'm working in the Timeline workspace up here, what I do is going to hit every single clip at the same time, hence why I'm going to apply film grain here. I want it to be, pretty much the same across the entire project. This is justifiable for shorter projects. For longer projects and projects with more varied and extreme lighting conditions, you are going to want to apply it in group and make sure that everything is matching together within the scene. It could well be that the film grain settings you have for a scene which is lit very darkly like this are not correct for a scene with much brighter lighting, and vice versa. So first I'm going to apply the film grain effect. I'm just going to drag it onto the node as per usual, and here I have my controls, and I'm just going to go into full viewer mode. Here we go. So here I can see the full effect of the film grain at the time applying. So first we can choose from a selection of presets, and these are a great place to start. With fine grain, we don't really perceive the finest details, the real differences between different stocks. The average viewer doesn't really notice that. So it's fine for us to start from something pre-made and then dial in the strength of that later on. So I'm going to go up here, and I like 35mm, I'll pick 35mm film for this one. Now after that we have opacity, which dictates how visible the grain actually is, with 0 being invisible, 1 being as visible as possible. If we check the grain only box, we can actually see the layer of grain which is being used. We can actually see the layer of grain which is being used for our overlay. And now we have a big set of grain parameters. So these sliders let us make adjustments to the grain layer itself. So for example, if I put grain only up here, you can actually see the difference all of this is having. The texture slider will change how complex our noise appears to be, and this is counterintuitive, however, as higher values produce simpler textures. So if I take a look at this and I drag it right up, you can see I get this weird frog spawn kind of weird cellular kind of structure, and if I drag it down, you can see I get a much grainier, much more tactile, organic kind of a structure there. And it's basically like the scale. You can see I'm almost zooming in to this pattern. So from 0.7 is a bit kind of cellular for me. I'm going to bring it down to about 0.3, 0.35, 0.375. About there. Next we have grain size, and this is unsurprisingly going to adjust the size of the film layer. Now this is just a zoom in, zoom out. Whereas texture is still having an effect of the complexity of the texture of the film grain. This is literally zoom in, zoom out. I don't want it to be like that because then that implies a very small film cell, so I'm going to make it reasonably, probably down to about 0.55 is okay for this one. Then we have grain aspect ratio. After that we have grain aspect ratio. This will stretch our grain out across the x-axis when we drag to the right and squeeze it in as we drag to the left. So I can change the aspect ratio of my grain depending on whether or not I have something that's, 16 by 9, cinema scope, that kind of thing. Right now, I'm just going to leave it at its default value. I don't need to play around with this. After that, we have offset. Now this one is just like the offset wheel from our primary wheels. It will make the grain layer uniformly darker or brighter. Left is darker, and right is brighter. Because we have quite a dark image here, I'm going to drag, that's symmetry, that's the wrong one. Because we have quite a dark image here, I'm going to drag my offset ever so slightly to the right, and this will help the grain become a little bit more visible under these circumstances. So I'm just going to bring it up to maybe 0.54, just a little bit, not too much, because I don't want grain to be distracting. Cool. Then we have symmetry. This one affects brightness, but it does so in an odd way. It will shift the image either above or below 50% brightness according to our Luma waveform. This has the effect of squeezing the contrast ratio of the film grayer together towards either the brighter or the darker values. If you find that dark or bright values are an issue in your grain overlay, this control can calm those annoying details down. So let's say, for example, the darker grain here isn't going to have much of an effect. With symmetry, I can kind of push the whole thing towards the brighter end of the spectrum a little bit, hoping then afterwards I'm going to get more of a visible effect for my film grain overlay, and I can come back and play with this later on. So let's say 0.65 for symmetry here. Then there's grain softness. This is just blur for the film grain. Easy to understand, easy to use. I drag softness up and blur it out, not very good, and then it's full sharpness. I'm going to reset that. I'm going to leave that at about 0.3 there. I think that's just about right. And finally, we have saturation. Now, by default, the grain is black and white because that's the effect we get with the actual grain of film, that kind of silver crystals effect that we get. But if we turn the saturation up to give us colored noise, we get the kind of television noise effect where we have multicolored grains. And if I turn that up, you start to see, red, green, blue, and this looks a bit more like TV noise to me. I happen to prefer the effect film grain gives us when it stays black and white, so I'm going to leave this at 0 for now. Now, to finish this off, we also have our advanced controls, and the names of these can be deceiving. I need to undo grain only here, and then go back. You can now see the effect the grain is having. If I turn it off versus turn it on, you can see I get a much stronger effect now because I've made the grain a lot brighter. You can actually see it much more effectively. But we're going to play around with the advanced controls here and get it just so. So we have 3 sliders here, and initially these can be a little bit deceiving. These sliders actually allow us to define how much of an impact our film grain layer has on different parts of our tonal range. The shadows, mids, and highlight sliders represent the strength of the composite on each of these 3 regions of our tonal range. That is to say, if I drag my shadow slider up to the right, the film grain layer has more effect in the shadows of our image. It does not make the grain layer itself darker or brighter. And if I drag detail highlights down, our film grain layer has less effect on the highlights. And if I drag midtones up, you can see the film grain's having a much stronger or a much weaker effect on the midtones. Now, because we have quite a dark image here, I'm going to bring my shadows up to maybe about 0.6, 0.65, just so I do get a little bit of nice grainy detail back here in the background. So using all these together, I can fine-tune the impact of the grain on my image. If I'm finding that it's too visible in a certain place because of the lighting, I can go in here and I can play around with them. Which is why, really, you should be sorting out film grain on a scene-by-scene or a lighting setup-by-lighting setup basis, not for the entire project. Because this is a relatively short and simple project, that is absolutely fine. In longer projects with multiple different scenes, multiple different locations, lighting setups, you should be applying your grain on a scene-by-scene basis, okay? So this has been a good overview of the film grain effect, and it's a nice way to round out an intensive module with an easier effect. We're going to put it all together now by moving on to our penultimate practical project, so click on through once you're ready.